On a Tuesday morning in March of 1996, Delmar Jessup stood at the edge of his machine shed in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a flatbed truck come slowly up the gravel drive. The truck was moving the way trucks move when they're carrying something fragile or something heavy, which is to say it was moving carefully, with a kind of deliberate patience that made you pay attention. Delmar was 71 years old. He had farmed the same 520 acres in Hardin County his entire adult life. He had buried a wife, outlasted 3 recessions, survived the farm crisis of the 1980s by the narrowest of margins, and he had not, in all those years, been the kind of man who made a habit of being surprised. But when that flatbed came around the bend in the drive and he saw what was sitting on it, chained down and painted the same faded two-tone green and yellow it had always been, he sat down on the step of his shed and he didn't say a word for a long time. Let me tell you about the tractor on that flatbed, because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what it meant. It was a 1953 Oliver 88, a row crop configuration with a 6-cylinder gasoline engine that Oliver had been building since 1947 and had gotten very right by the time this one rolled off the line in Charles City, Iowa, which is about 40 miles from where Delmar was sitting. It weighed just over 5,000 pounds. It had a 5-speed transmission, a live PTO shaft, and a hydraulic system that Delmar's father, Clovis Jessup, had maintained with a devotion that some men reserved for Scripture. Clovis had bought it new in the spring of 1953 for $2,400, which was a serious sum of money for a man farming 320 acres in Hardin County on corn and oat ground that could be generous or punishing depending on the year and the rain. He had made the payments for 3 years. He had never missed one. Delmar grew up on that tractor. He learned to operate it when he was 9 years old, sitting on his father's lap on the steel seat with the cracked rubber pad that Clovis had never gotten around to replacing. He learned the sound of the engine when it was happy, and the sound of it when it was working too hard. He learned the feel of the clutch, which was stiff and required your whole leg, and the feel of the throttle, which was smooth and responsive in a way that always seemed slightly miraculous for a machine of that age and weight. By the time Delmar was 16, he could plow a furrow as straight as a fence line with that tractor, and Clovis had told him so, which was as close to a compliment as Clovis Jessup ever came. The Oliver had done everything on that farm for 15 years. It had pulled a 2-bottom plow through ground that would stop a lesser machine. It had powered the PTO on the corn picker through October harvests that ran from first light to full dark. It had pulled a grain wagon loaded to the rails across fields that turned to mud in the spring and cracked like old pottery in August. It had never stranded Clovis or Delmar in a field. It had never failed to start in weather that would discourage a man from trying. It was, in the language of that time and place, a good tractor, which meant it was dependable, which meant it was trusted, which meant it was something close to family. But in 1968, things changed. Delmar was 43 years old, and he had taken over the farm from Clovis, who was slowing down in the way men slow down when the work has been honest and the years have been long. Delmar had expanded the operation to 520 acres by renting the Harrington ground to the east, and the Oliver 88, as good as it was beginning to show its limits. The new ground needed more horsepower. The new equipment needed more hydraulic capacity. John Deere had just released the 4020, which was producing 91 horsepower at the drawbar and had a synchro-range transmission that made the Oliver feel like a relic. International Harvester had the 1456. case had the 1030. The world was moving, and Delmar, who was a practical man, moved with it. He sold the Oliver 88 in the fall of 1968 for $800 to a man named Arlen Whitmore, who farmed a smaller operation south of Eldora. He used the money toward a down payment on a John Deere 402. That cost him $7,400 and changed the way he farmed in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The 402 was a remarkable machine. He knew that. But the day he watched Arlen Whitmore drive the Oliver off the property and down the county road, Delmar stood in the drive for longer than he needed to. His son, Gary, was 12 years old that fall, and he stood next to his father, and they both watched until the tractor was out of sight. Neither of them said anything. That was the Jessup way. Let me tell you about what happened to that tractor over the next 28 years, because the path it took to get back to that gravel drive is as much a part of this story as anything else. Arlen Whitmore used the Oliver for 7 years on his smaller operation, which was exactly what the tractor was suited for, and it served him without complaint. When Arlen retired in 1975 and sold his land, the Oliver went with the equipment auction. It brought $400, which was already less than Delmar had sold it for, because by 1975 the world had decided that anything without a cab and a turbocharger was a step backward. A man named Dykstra from over near Iowa Falls bought it for his hobby farm, used it occasionally, and eventually pushed it into a machine shed where it sat for 11 years under a canvas tarp that slowly rotted and a layer of dust that slowly thickened. When Dykstra died in 1986, his estate sold the farm and the equipment. The Oliver sold at the estate auction for $275. The man who bought it was a parts dealer from Waterloo who stripped the hydraulic pump, the carburetor, and the magneto and sold them individually for more than he'd paid for the whole tractor. What remained sat in his salvage yard in varying states of exposure for 6 years, which is not kind to cast iron and not kind to rubber and not kind to anything that was built to be used rather than abandoned. That is where Gary Jessup's son, Delmar's grandson, found it. Let me tell you about Colt Jessup, because you need to understand the young man before you can understand what he did. Colt was 24 years old in the spring of 1994 when he drove past that salvage yard on Route 175 outside Waterloo and saw the tractor sitting in the back row behind a pile of combine headers and a stack of cultivator frames. He almost didn't recognize it. The paint had faded from its original green and yellow to something closer to gray and rust. The seat was gone entirely. The exhaust stack was bent. The front tires were flat and cracked. But the sheet metal had its original lines, and the lines of an Oliver 88 are distinctive in the way that certain things are distinctive. Not flashy, but unmistakable to anyone who grew up around them. Colt had grown up around them. His grandfather had told him about the Oliver enough times that the tractor had become, in the way of family stories, more real in the telling than it had ever been in the original. Colt pulled over. He walked into the salvage yard and found the owner and asked about the tractor. The owner wanted $350 for what was left of it. Colt had $400 in his checking account and a truck payment due in 2 weeks. He bought the tractor anyway. He borrowed a trailer from a friend and hauled it back to his grandfather's farm, which is where he had been living since he'd come back from 2 years at Iowa State, where he had studied agricultural mechanics and had developed, among other things, a serious interest in the engineering history of American farm equipment. Delmar watched Colt unload the tractor and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That's Arlen Whitmore's tractor." Colt said, "That's your tractor, Grandpa." Delmar looked at it for a while longer. "It was," he said, and then he went inside. What happened over the next 18 months is the kind of thing that happens when a young man with mechanical knowledge, patience, and a specific kind of stubbornness decides that something worth saving is worth the time it takes to save it properly. Colt did not rush the restoration. He researched the Oliver 88 with the same methodical attention he had applied to his coursework at Iowa State, which is to say, he was thorough, and he was precise, and he did not guess when he could know. He sourced a replacement carburetor from an Oliver parts supplier in Ohio. He found a magneto that had been rebuilt by a man in Nebraska who specialized in nothing else. He machined a new governor shaft on a lathe at a machine shop in Eldora because the original was worn beyond tolerance and he couldn't find a replacement. He stripped the engine to the block, measured every bore, found that 3 cylinders were within spec and 1 needed a sleeve, and had the sleeve installed by an engine shop in Iowa Falls that had been doing this work since 1961. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump himself, ordering seals and valves from a catalog that was itself a historical document, printed in 1971, that he had found in a box of his grandfather's papers in the machine shed. He painted it himself, in the original Oliver meadow green and clover yellow, using color codes he had tracked down through the Oliver Collectors Association. He found a period-correct seat. He replaced every rubber component on the machine. He did not cut corners. He did not hurry. Delmar watched all of this from a distance. He did not help, not because he didn't want to, but because his hands had begun to trouble him in the way that hands trouble men who have used them hard for 50 years. And because he understood, with the quiet wisdom of a man who has watched things built and rebuilt, that this was Colt's work to do. But he watched. He came out to the shed in the evenings and stood in the doorway and looked at whatever stage the tractor was in. And sometimes he asked a question, and sometimes he didn't. Colt noticed that his grandfather came more often as the restoration progressed. By the time Colt was doing the final paint work, Delmar was coming out twice a day. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone restore something that mattered to someone else? Not to you, to them? There is a particular quality to that kind of attention. The attention of the person who remembers what the thing was before it became what it is now. Delmar Jessup had driven that tractor for 15 years. He knew its sounds and its habits and its weight under him. He had sold it for practical reasons and had never, in 28 years, stopped knowing it was gone. And now here was his grandson, who had never driven it, who had only heard about it, putting it back together piece by piece with a precision and care that Clovis himself would have recognized and respected. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The restoration was finished in October of 1995. Colt started the engine for the first time in the machine shed with Delmar standing 3 feet away. The engine turned over twice, caught, and settled into the idle that a well-tuned Oliver 88 makes, which is a sound that people who know it describe as a lope, a distinctive, uneven firing rhythm that is specific to the engine's design, and that sounds, to anyone who grew up around it, like something alive. Delmar put his hand on the hood. He didn't say anything. Colt watched his grandfather's face and decided not to say anything either. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand why the next part of this story happened the way it did. Dale Crowley was 58 years old in 1996, and he was the kind of man who had built his identity around being right about things. He had farmed 1,400 acres in Hardin County, which made him one of the larger operators in the county, and he had done it with a fleet of modern equipment that he updated with a regularity that suggested he was as interested in the equipment as he was in the farming. He ran John Deere 8000 series tractors, which were producing 200-plus horsepower, and had electronics packages that could have run a small office. He had a combine that cost more than most of the farms in the county had sold for in the 1980s. He was not a bad man. He was a successful man, which is a different thing, and success had given him the particular kind of certainty that comes from being right often enough that you stop seriously entertaining the possibility of being wrong. Dale and Delmar had known each other for 40 years. They were not friends exactly, but they were neighbors in the way that men are neighbors in a small county, which is to say they knew each other's business and respected each other's land and occasionally needed each other and occasionally irritated each other and would have done anything for each other in a genuine emergency. Dale had watched the Jessup farm get smaller relative to his own operation over the decades, and had developed, without ever quite saying so, the opinion that Delmar was a competent farmer of the old school who had simply failed to scale up at the moments when scaling up was possible. He said this with his equipment choices and his acreage, and the new cab he had put on his machine shed, not with his words. Dale Crowley was not a cruel man. He was just a man who believed that bigger and newer were, in most cases, better, and who had arranged his life as evidence of that belief. In January of 1996, Dale Crowley had a problem. The problem was a drainage tile project on the east end of his property, 120 acres of ground that had always been marginal because of a high water table and a clay subsoil that held water the way a bowl holds water. He had contracted with a tile drainage company out of Marshalltown to install a new subsurface drainage system, which was the right solution and a substantial investment, somewhere in the range of $47,000 for the tile, the trenching equipment, and the labor. The work had been going well until they hit the northeast corner of the field, which sat at the bottom of a long, gentle slope and had accumulated, over the previous 3 weeks of freeze-thaw cycling, a depth of saturated clay and standing water that the trenching machine could not operate in. The machine, a Ditch Witch RT115, was a capable piece of equipment rated for most soil conditions, but it was not rated for what it found in that corner, and on the third day of trying, it sank to its frame rails in clay that had the consistency of wet concrete and would not move. The tile company called in a second machine, a larger track excavator, to pull the Ditch Witch out. The excavator sank too, not as deep, because it was on tracks, but deep enough that it could not apply its full pulling force without risking the same fate. The tile company then called a wrecker service from Iowa Falls, which sent a heavy-duty truck with a winch rated at 40,000 pounds. The wrecker made progress, perhaps 18 inches over the course of 2 hours, and then the ground shifted in the way saturated clay shifts when you apply force to something embedded in it, and the Ditch Witch moved sideways instead of out, and the angle of pull became wrong, and the wrecker operator shut down the winch rather than risk snapping the cable. By this point, Dale Crowley had been watching this for 3 days and had spent, between equipment rental and labor and the wrecker service, approximately $8,200 on the attempt to free a machine that was costing him $600 a day in rental fees while it sat immobile in his field. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who had run out of obvious solutions, and that was a new and uncomfortable position for him. Let me tell you about what Colt Jessup had been thinking during those 3 days, because he had been watching from the Jessup property line, which ran along the eastern edge of Dale Crowley's problem field. Colt had watched the Ditch Witch go in. He had watched the excavator try and fail. He had watched the wrecker make its 18 inches of progress and then stop. And he had been thinking, with the particular quality of attention he had developed at Iowa State and refined in 18 months of restoring a machine that required him to understand not just what things did, but why they did it, about a different approach. The approach he was thinking about was not complicated. It was, in fact, very old. It was the approach of applying a sustained, slow, steady pulling force at the correct angle over an extended period of time, rather than a large, fast, intermittent force at whatever angle was convenient. The principle behind it was mechanical advantage, combined with patience, and it was the principle that had governed how men moved heavy things before the age of hydraulics and high-horsepower engines, and it was a principle that the Oliver 88 sitting in his grandfather's machine shed was, by design and by nature, very well suited to demonstrate. He went and talked to his grandfather. Delmar listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was his habit. When Colt was done, Delmar said, "You want to use the Oliver?" Colt said yes. Delmar said, "Dale Crowley's field." Colt said yes. Delmar looked out the window for a moment. "Dale, know you're thinking this?" Colt said he hadn't said anything to Dale yet. Delmar nodded slowly. "Go talk to him," he said. "Take the tractor." Let me tell you about that conversation because it is the part of this story that people in Hardin County still repeat when they tell it, which they do at the co-op and at the implement dealer and at the cafe in Eldora, where men have been drinking coffee and talking about farming since before most of them were born. Colt drove the Oliver 88 across the Jessup property and down the county road to the entrance of Crowley's East Field on a Wednesday morning in late January. The temperature was 28 degrees, and the sky was the color of old tin. Dale Crowley was standing at the field entrance with the tile company foreman, a man named Greg Thornton, who had been in the drainage business for 22 years and had seen most of what could go wrong with a tile project, and was not, at this particular moment, in a mood to see something new go wrong. They were looking at a clipboard and talking in the low, serious voices of men who are discussing money. They heard the Oliver before they saw it, because the Oliver's engine, at full operating temperature on a cold morning, makes a sound that carries. Thornton looked up first. He watched the tractor come down the road and turn into the field entrance, and his expression did not change because he was a professional, and professionals do not let their expressions change when something surprises them, but his eyes moved in a way that indicated surprise. Dale Crowley turned around and looked at the tractor, and then looked at the young man driving it, and then looked at the tractor again. "Morning," Colt said. He shut the engine down and climbed off. Dale said, "That's Delmar's tractor." Then, after a moment, "That's the old Oliver." Colt explained what he was proposing. He explained it clearly and without embellishment, the way he had been taught to explain mechanical problems at Iowa State, with the cause first and the solution second, and the reasoning connecting them. He said that the problem with the current approach was not a lack of power, but a lack of sustained, low-speed pulling force at the correct angle. He said that the Oliver 88, with its live PTO and its direct drive transmission and its weight distribution, was capable of applying a steady drawbar pull of approximately 4,800 pounds at a walking pace, sustained indefinitely, which was different in kind from the winch pull that the wrecker had applied, which was high force and intermittent and had shifted the machine sideways. He said he would need a set of logging chains, a snatch block, and about 2 hours. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Greg Thornton started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has spent 22 years in a specialized field and has developed, as specialists do, a particular kind of confidence in his own expertise, and who has just been told by a 24-year-old on a 43-year-old tractor that the solution to a problem that has defeated 3 pieces of modern equipment is patience and a snatch block. It was the laugh of a man who has already decided the answer before he has heard the question. Colt recognized it. He had heard variations of it at Iowa State when he suggested things that were old-fashioned, and at equipment shows when he talked about the Oliver, and at the salvage yard when he told the owner what he intended to do with what was left of the tractor. He did not react to it. Dale Crowley did not laugh. He looked at the Oliver, and he looked at Colt, and he said, "Son, that machine is putting out what? Maybe 40 horsepower?" 44 at the drawbar, Colt said, "but horsepower isn't the issue. I've got a wrecker out here with a 40,000-pound winch." "I know," Colt said. "I watched it. The problem is the angle of pull and the intermittent load. You're moving the machine sideways and then stopping. Every time you stop, the clay reseals around it. You need a straight pull at a low, constant speed that doesn't give the clay time to reseal." Thornton had stopped laughing. He was looking at Colt with the expression of a man who has just heard something he doesn't want to take seriously, but can't quite find the reason to dismiss. Dale Crowley looked at the field. He looked at the Ditch Witch sitting in the clay 200 yards away with its frame rails below grade. He looked at the Oliver. He was a practical man, and the practical calculation was not complicated. He had spent $8,200 in 3 days and accomplished nothing, and this was going to cost him nothing except 2 hours. "You damage anything out there," Dale said, "that's on you." "Understood," Colt said, "and if it doesn't work, I don't want to hear about it." "You won't," Colt said. Thornton said, "I'll get you the chains. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What is it that makes a person so certain that old means inadequate? Not skeptical, certain, because there is a difference between looking at a 1953 tractor and thinking that's probably not the right tool for this job, which is a reasonable thought, and looking at a 1953 tractor and laughing, which is a different thing entirely. The laugh is not about the tractor. The laugh is about the laugher. It is about the particular comfort of knowing, or believing you know, how the world works and what belongs in it and what has been superseded and left behind. Greg Thornton had spent 22 years in the drainage business, and he knew a great deal, and what he knew had served him well, and the laugh was the sound of that knowledge defending itself against something it hadn't accounted for. Colt Jessup did not spend any time thinking about this. He had work to do. Let me tell you about the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, because they are the reason this story is still being told in Hardin County, Iowa, 30 years later. Colt drove the Oliver out to the stuck machine, keeping to the higher ground along the field's north edge, where the clay was firmer. He assessed the situation with the unhurried attention of someone who has spent 18 months learning to look at a mechanical problem from every angle before touching it. The Ditch Witch was embedded in the clay at roughly a 12-degree list to the port side, which meant the ground had shifted under it unevenly, which meant a straight pull from directly behind would not bring it out cleanly. He needed to correct the list first, which meant the first pull had to come from the high side at a slight angle. Not to extract the machine, but to level it, and then a second pull from directly behind to bring it out along its own axis. He explained this to Thornton, who had followed him out on foot and was watching with the arms-crossed posture of a man who's not yet convinced but is paying attention. Thornton said, "You're going to make 2 pulls?" Colt said, "At least 2, maybe 3. Thornton looked at the clay. He looked at the Oliver. He uncrossed his arms. Colt set the snatch block on a fence post at the field's north edge, which gave him a redirected pull that would come at the Ditch Witch from the correct angle for the leveling pull. He ran the logging chain from the Oliver's drawbar through the snatch block and out to the Ditch Witch's front toe point, which was rated for exactly this kind of extraction and which the wrecker had not used because the wrecker's cable had been attached to the rear. He checked every connection twice. He checked the chain's tension by hand. He climbed back onto the Oliver. Dale Crowley had walked out to the field by this time and was standing 30 yards back, which was the correct distance for a man who is watching a chain operation and knows enough to stay out of the snap zone. His hands were in his coat pockets. His face was neutral. Colt engaged the clutch slowly, easing the Oliver into first gear at low throttle. The chain came taut. The Oliver's rear tires, the original 13.6-38 rubber that Colt had replaced during the restoration, pressed into the clay and found purchase in the firmer ground beneath the surface layer. The engine note changed, dropping slightly as the load came on and then steadying as Colt brought the throttle up to the point where the tractor was working hard but not laboring, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that you can only learn by feel. For the first 90 seconds, nothing visible happened. The chain was taut. The Oliver was pulling. The Ditch Witch was not moving. Thornton checked his watch. Dale Crowley looked at the ground. Then, at approximately the 2-minute mark, the Ditch Witch moved. Not much, perhaps 3 inches, but it moved, and when it moved on the correct axis, the list beginning to correct. The machine coming up slightly on its port side as the clay released its grip in the way that clay releases when a sustained force is applied to it over time. Not all at once, but in increments, like a hand slowly opening. Colt felt the load shift through the drawbar and adjusted his throttle accordingly, keeping the pull steady, not surging, not stopping. The Oliver's engine settled into a rhythm that sounded, to anyone who knew the machine, like it was doing exactly what it had been built to do. The level and pull took 18 minutes. By the end of it, the Ditch Witch was sitting level in the clay, still embedded but no longer listing. Colt shut down the Oliver, climbed off, and repositioned the chain for the extraction pull. Straight back along the machine's axis, no snatch block this time, direct pull from the Oliver's drawbar to the Ditch Witch's rear toe point. He walked the chain. He checked the connections. He climbed back on. Thornton had not said anything in 18 minutes. He was standing with his hands at his sides now, not his pockets, watching with the focused attention of a man who has revised his initial assessment and is gathering new data. The extraction pull began at the same low, steady throttle. The chain came taut. The Oliver pressed into the ground. And then, over the course of the next 22 minutes, the Ditch Witch came out of that clay field the way a tooth comes out of a jaw when the right force is applied in the right direction with the right patience. Not all at once, not with a dramatic lurch, but steadily, incrementally, a few inches at a time, with the sound of the clay releasing its grip rising from a low groan to something that, when the machine finally came fully free, was close enough to a crack that Dale Crowley took a step back. The Ditch Witch sat on solid ground. Colt shut the Oliver down. The engine ticked in the cold air. Thornton walked over to the Ditch Witch and walked around it and looked at it from every angle and then looked at Colt. His expression was the expression of a man who has just watched something he had decided was impossible happen in front of him, and who is in the process of revising a belief that he has held for a long time. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" Colt said, "About 2.5 hours. Thornton said, "I mean extraction work." Colt said, "This is the first time." Thornton looked at the tractor. He looked at the chain. He said, "I'll be damned." Dale Crowley walked over slowly. He stood next to the freed machine and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the Oliver, and then looked at Colt. His face had the quality that faces have when the certainty has gone out of them. Not collapsed, not destroyed, but quietly vacated, the way a room looks when the furniture has been moved. He said, "How did you know the angle was wrong?" Colt said, "Because the wrecker was pulling from the rear and the machine was listed. You can't pull a listed machine straight out. You have to correct the list first." Dale said, "The wrecker operator didn't know that?" Colt said, "He might have known it. He might have been in a hurry." Dale nodded slowly. He looked at the Oliver for a long time. He said, "That's your grandfather's tractor." Colt said, "It is now." Dale said, "He sold it in '68. Colt said, "Yes, sir." Dale said, "You restored it." Colt said, "Yes, sir." Dale looked at the machine for another long moment. Then he said, "What do I owe you?" Colt said, "Nothing." Dale looked at him. "Nothing?" Colt said, "Buy Grandpa dinner sometime. He's the one who told me to come over." Dale Crowley looked at the Oliver 88 sitting in his field on a January morning in 1996, with its engine cooling and its chains coiled neatly on the drawbar where Colt had stowed them, and he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "I laughed at you this morning." Colt said, "Greg laughed. You didn't." Dale said, "I thought it." Colt said, "That's all right." Dale said, "It's not, really." He paused. "What made you think the old tractor could do what 3 modern machines couldn't?" Colt said, "It wasn't about what the tractor could do. It was about what the problem needed. The problem needed a slow, steady pull at the right angle. The Oliver does slow and steady better than anything I know. That's what it was built for." He paused. "Modern equipment is built for speed and for protecting itself from overload. The Oliver doesn't protect itself. It just pulls." Dale Crowley went home and called Delmar Jessup that evening. He told Delmar what had happened, which Delmar already knew because Colt had told him. But Dale told him anyway, the way a man tells a story when the telling of it is itself the point. He said, "Your grandson knows what he's doing." Delmar said, "He does." Dale said, "That tractor." Delmar said, "Yes." Dale said, "I remember when you sold it." Delmar said, "So do I." There was a pause. Dale said, "I've been thinking about buying a smaller tractor for the odd jobs, something I don't have to fire up the big iron for." Delmar said, "I know a fellow who restores them." Dale said, "I figured you might." Let me tell you about what happened in the years after, because the story doesn't end with the Ditch Witch sitting on solid ground in a January field. Word moves in a small county the way water moves in a flat field. Not fast, but everywhere, and you can't stop it. By the following spring, most of the farmers in the county knew the broad outline of what had happened on Dale Crowley's east field, and a fair number of them knew the details, because Greg Thornton had told the story at the co-op in Eldora with an honesty that did him credit, acknowledging exactly what he had laughed at and exactly how wrong he had been. He told it without embellishment and without excuse, which is the most persuasive way to tell a story. And it was persuasive. People listened. People thought about it. Colt Jessup began getting calls. Not many at first. A farmer south of Ackley who had a stuck wagon he couldn't get out of a wet corner. A man near Hubbard who had a tree stump that his skid loader couldn't handle. A woman over near Radcliffe who needed a stone foundation moved from an old building site without disturbing the tile line underneath it. Colt took every call. He took the Oliver to every job. He charged a modest hourly rate that was less than the going rate for equipment rental, and he did the work with the same careful, methodical attention he had applied to the restoration, assessing each problem before touching it, using the minimum force necessary, applied in the correct direction for the correct duration. He was not always the right answer. He knew that. There were jobs that needed modern equipment, needed hydraulic force or reach or speed that the Oliver couldn't provide, and when that was the case he said so and pointed people toward the right solution. But there were more jobs than he had expected, perhaps 1 in 3, where the right answer was patience and mechanical advantage, and a machine that pulled without protecting itself from the effort. Those jobs he took. Delmar watched all of this from the house and from the machine shed and from the passenger seat of Colt's truck when his grandson drove him out to watch a job. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. But he watched with the quality of attention that a man gives to something he has been waiting a long time to see. And once, on the drive back from a job near Iowa Falls, where Colt had used the Oliver to extract a grain bin auger that had been driven into the ground by a collapsed support, and that 3 other people had told the farmer was a total loss, Delmar said, "Your great-grandfather would have understood what you're doing." Colt said, "Tell me about him." And Delmar did for the rest of the drive home, talking about Clovis Jessup in the way that men talk about the people who taught them things that turned out to matter, with a specificity and a warmth that is different from ordinary memory, that is closer to gratitude. Clovis Jessup had bought the Oliver 88 new in 1953 because he believed, based on 40 years of farming, that a tractor that pulled steadily was worth more than a tractor that pulled hard. He had told Delmar this when Delmar was 12 years old. He had said, "Any machine can pull hard for a minute. The question is, which ones can pull steady for an hour?" He had demonstrated this on the Oliver many times, in wet fields and dry fields, and fields that should have beaten the machine but didn't, because Clovis knew how to apply the tractor's capabilities to the problem's requirements, rather than the other way around. He had died in 1979 at the age of 81, and Delmar had buried him in the Jessup plot in the county cemetery north of Eldora, and the Oliver had been gone from the farm for 11 years by then, but Delmar had thought about it at the funeral anyway. Let me tell you about the spring of 2003, because that is where the last part of this story takes place. Delmar Jessup died in February of 2003, a month after his 78th birthday, from a heart that had worked as hard as everything else on the Jessup farm and had finally decided it had done enough. He died in the farmhouse he had been born in, which is not a common thing anymore and was not common even then, and he died with the knowledge that the farm was in good hands, which is the knowledge a farmer needs at the end. Gary, Colt's father, had taken over the operation formally, but everyone understood that Colt was the one who would carry it forward, and Colt understood this too. The Oliver 88 was in the machine shed when Delmar died, as it had been every winter since Colt brought it back. Colt had kept it in the condition he had restored it to, which meant it was maintained to a standard that the original factory would have recognized, and it was ready to work whenever it was needed, which was regularly. It had become, in the 7 years since the Crowley Field incident, something between a tool and a landmark, the kind of thing that people in a county know about and point to and tell stories about, the way they point to an old barn or a particular tree that has been there long enough to become part of the landscape. At the funeral, Dale Crowley came. He was 65 years old by then and had slowed down somewhat, having sold 400 acres of his operation to a neighbor and kept the rest, which was still substantial but was no longer the statement it had once been. He stood at the graveside in the cold February air, and he did not say much, but he was there, which was the point. Afterward, at the farmhouse, he found Colt in the kitchen and said, "Your grandfather was a good man." Colt said, "He was." Dale said, "He raised a good family." Colt said, "He had good material to work with. He always said that." Dale looked at his coffee cup. He said, "I've thought about that day in the field a lot, the January day." Colt said, "I know." Dale said, "I should have believed you faster." Colt said, "You let me try. That's what mattered." Dale said, "I laughed." Colt said, "Greg laughed. You thought it." Dale looked at him. "You said that before." Colt said, "It was true before." They stood in the kitchen of the Jessup farmhouse for a moment in the particular silence of men who have known each other across a long story and have arrived at a place in it where most things have been said. Dale said, "What are you going to do with the Oliver?" Colt said, "Keep farming with it. Keep doing the work." Dale said, "It's a remarkable machine." Colt said, "It's a well-maintained machine. That's most of what remarkable is." Dale thought about that. He said, "Your great-grandfather bought it new." Colt said, 1953. Paid $2,400 for it. Took 3 years to pay it off. Dale said, "And now it's still working." Colt said, "It'll work as long as someone takes care of it. That's true of most things." Dale nodded.